It is a privilege and honor for me to introduce Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein. It shouldn't be surprising for us that Dr. Kuhnlein grew up in a rich food culture. She grew up on a small strawberry and asparagus farm in southern New Jersey, and then is proud of her Pennsylvania Dutch food and farming heritage, which was influenced by Caribbean migrant workers and Italian immigrants in the community that she grew up in. Many of you might know that Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein has published many peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. She's got a number of books on Indigenous peoples' food systems. She also has had and holds many prestigious leadership roles nationally and internationally. And she's been the recipient of many awards and honors. At the core of all of this work is research, rigorous research that's accessible, and research that contributes to our understanding of the vast knowledge Indigenous people have of their culture and ecosystems. It's the kind of research and work which has important implications for the health and future of Indigenous peoples, but it also can benefit all of humanity on this planet because it's dealing with sustainable food systems and the knowledge that's part of that. Her research career spans over 40 years and has contributed significant knowledge on food composition, cultural food practices, as well as dietary quality. From the time she did her PhD work with the Hopi in Arizona on strontium and lead, she has engaged communities in research. As a new professor at the University of British Columbia, she collaborated with the Nuxalk Nation on a model of health promotion that was rooted in their cultural food heritage and foodways. Then, as a founding director for the Center on Indigenous Peoples' Nutrition Environment at McGill University, her work with diverse Inuit and First Nations communities across the North changed the landscape of our knowledge of what we understand for Indigenous peoples' food systems and the sustainabilities of these food systems. And many of you will know the book, Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems, Environments, and Health. And if you don't, I know that Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein will be referring to this in her talk. But it's an important book that talks about the many dimensions of cultural diversity and environment. So bringing these knowledges and ways of looking at food together. I use this book in a course that I teach. It's so important. I'm so glad to have that resource. And I use many of the lessons that Dr. Kuhnlein has shared with me and that I have learned with Dr. Kuhnlein, who's a very important mentor to me. First, as my undergraduate advisor, when I was doing my dietetics work at McGill, and then as my advisor for my master's work. She has had a profound impact on my career as a researcher. I have deep respect and a lot of love for her. I'm proud to call Harriet my colleague and my dear friend. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein.
Wow, Trina, that was great. Thanks so much. It always means a lot to me when I hear you say nice things like that. But in fact, everybody, this whole conference just makes my heart sing. It is so profound, all of the wisdom that's coming forward that has never been put together in one place before. And I think that is really amazing to have all these expressions of traditional food beauty and success stories and the wonderful eloquence that we hear from so many speakers. We've all learned a lot, and I've especially learned an amazing amount, and I thank all of you for that. Special thanks to Seeds of Native Search, of course, for sponsoring this whole thing, and the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. I wonder how many days it will take me to get that name straight. And, of course, the Healthy Foods, Healthy Lives Institute of the University of Minnesota. And I want to especially thank Professor Mindy Kurzer for her leadership in making this happen. All right, so my topic today is Indigenous peoples' food systems. And we're looking at global awareness and action at thinking about the international level. And what my plan is to introduce to you some of the major agencies that deal with Indigenous peoples' food systems and food sovereignty. I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, know about some of them. But just to give you a quick overview of them, and then to talk more at length about the CINE programs that Trina has introduced to you. And there will be a couple of videos sprinkled, 2 videos actually, short ones, throughout. So when we talk about indigenous and tribal people in the world today, we have to realize there are many of them. 390 million indigenous and tribal people, and this is probably the low estimate within the UN system, in 70 countries, and they comprise 5% of the world's population, as now measured, but 15% of the world's poor, as we measure with income. 5,000 identified groups, 4,000 languages, and most of them endangered. But throughout all of the work that I've recognized through the UN system and our own programs, this main issue resonates everywhere, this marginalization that's due to violation of the right of indigenous peoples to their traditional lands and territories. Now, to put the numbers in context, in Canada, for example, we have on record with government 1.4 million indigenous peoples, and they comprise 4.3% of our Canadian population in 600 recognized tribal governments of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Here in the US, it's hard to pin down numbers, but the latest ones I saw, 1 to 2% of the American population registered as indigenous, but with 1.8 million people enrolled tribally, the census reveals that at least 4 times this number of people declare heritage with American tribes. So it's important to think about numbers because it's not just you, it's not just us here in isolation, it's the world everywhere is having issues to deal with. So at the international level in the United Nations system, most importantly, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. They have created the International Decades of World's Indigenous Peoples, 2 of them that I was participating in from afar, and there's probably another one now, and importantly, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which came out of the UN system and is now tabled in all participating governments in the United Nations. There's Biodiversity International, and that's not a misprint. This is an organization that focuses on the biodiversity, and our look at it is through food systems, of course, of indigenous peoples. But this organization is in the United Nations Environment Program. It's based in Rome, together with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which is one of the UN's biggest organizations. And the FAO has a large program for indigenous peoples. Some of you were at Slow Food recently that was held in Turin, Italy. But there's also an indigenous Terra Madre that's in partnership with Slow Food. The first one was held in 2011 in Sweden, and the second one in 2015 in Northeast India. Also in Rome, going further down the list there, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, another Rome agency that's important for funding for indigenous peoples. And it has the Indigenous Peoples Forum, that is a large gathering of many people from many different cultures and countries that came together for the first forum in 2015. And there's another one in the works now. And last but not least, I'm mentioning UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Now, the US and Canada don't belong to UNESCO at this time, But at this, it's important to mention their new program for recognizing intangible cultural heritages. And as part of that review process that governments support and submit for review by UNESCO are several indigenous food traditions. And in 2010, I'm aware of the traditional Mexican cuisine that was recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage. And UNESCO is based in Paris. So an important thing to mention about these UN organizations is this concept of food sovereignty that you all know about, and we've heard wonderful things about it here. But it's the recognition that food sovereignty is an essential prerequisite for food security. And a lot of the UN programs are committed to improving food security for the world's populations. But further to that, food security is an important prerequisite for food and dietary sustainability. There are other prerequisites for dietary and food sustainability, such as controlling climate change and conflict and all those kinds of things. But it's important to note that progression from food sovereignty to food security to food sustainability. So going on, just to call your attention, this is Victoria Talley Corpuz, an amazing woman. I hope you get to meet her someday. She is the leader of the United Nations Human Rights Council issues related to Indigenous peoples, and she is the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. She's an Indigenous woman from the Philippines and has been very active, a former chair of the UNPFII, and spends her entire life dedicated to these issues. So I'm going to ask the website of the FAO Indigenous Peoples Movement to come up, and if they could just scroll through it briefly so that you can see how big the FAO organization is in its efforts for Indigenous people. If you go to that website, FAO Indigenous People, you will see many, many videos. If you could just scroll down a little bit, yeah. You see, you can link into videos. I mean, there must be at least 100 videos there that you can use. There's maps, and there's lists of publications, including our CINE publication. So if you would show that short video clip from FAO. So that's just an example of the kinds of things you can find on the FAO website. So I'm going to switch now and talk about our Center for Indigenous Peoples' Nutrition and Environment that's based at McGill University and explain a bit our journey. We opened for our academic and education activities in 1993. Quite a while ago now. And you see our governing board there who has guided the center, 6 members of national indigenous organizations, giving us good participatory process with mutual trust and respect with the communities that we work with as indigenous researchers. Our work at CINE has been both quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative in that we have active wet labs looking at nutrient composition. So what CINE does is look at the qualitative and quantitative aspects of research on Indigenous peoples' food systems. I mentioned the laboratory work, food composition, contaminants, and we got our initial funding to look at organochlorine and heavy metal contaminants and nutrient benefits in foods in Arctic communities. The current director of CINE, since I have retired several years ago actually, is Professor Murray Humphreys. Anyway, I'll have to go through quickly, I think. Some of the communities in our early dietary research. So what we started out doing was looking at the benefits and risks in the Canadian Arctic. And these are the communities in the Yukon First Nations, the Northwest Territories, and the Inuit communities. Now, since that time, there are many more spots all over Canada and in other parts of the world that have contributed to this understanding of how Indigenous peoples' food systems contribute to health and culture. The Inuit of Nunavut, and you see a couple of slides here, just a community shot. Most of the Inuit communities take their food systems from the sea, but there are some land-based Inuit communities as well, and a Nunavut boy that you see there, and whale, blubber, and muktuk from the narwhal that was harvested from Baffin Island, where there are many Inuit communities. Over in the western part of the Canadian Arctic are the Gwich'in in the Northwest Territories. And you see some of the housing. Someone asked me the other day, don't the people up there still live in igloos? And can't we go there and find out what it's like before people had any processed foods? And in fact, the answer is no, because there's processed food everywhere, as you see there in the lower right-hand box. But the diversity and the quality of that food is, as you can imagine, and I'm sure all of you have issues with the kinds of foods that you have from the commercial network in your community. About 1990, CINE embarked on an international program to look at food systems from different parts of the world to try and bring some important concepts that have resonance everywhere when it comes to food systems. So there were three there in Canada, in the Nunavut Nation, in addition to the Dene and Inuit, and the Ngano and Awahun in South America, the Pohnpei people from the Federated States of Micronesia, and then in Asia, four, the Ainu in Japan, the Karen in Thailand, Dalit and Bahil in India, two different parts of India, and the Maasai and Igbo in Kenya and Nigeria in Africa. So our research process with these communities was in two phases. First of all, to document the local food systems, both the traditional and market foods that are used. And when I mean documentation, I mean a thorough listing of species and so forth. And the second phase, to implement the knowledge from those foods to create interventions that improve health by emphasizing those local food systems, with the overall goal to accumulate evidence that improving access to traditional food diversity for rural Indigenous peoples enhances their nutrition and health. We focused on rural people because the traditional food systems are still in evidence there in many places. These are our case study partners. We came together once a year for more than a dozen years here at the Research Center in Bellagio, Italy, the Rockefeller Foundation Center. And we shared ideas, cross-fertilizing our community projects to make the intervention. How do interventions work where they are, and how are they documented? This is a resource that's on the CINE website that you see there. It's about how to go about documenting a traditional food system in areas where there's very little market food. And it's important to note that all of the information that came in this research process was retained and used in the communities in many ways to build the intervention programs. So the documentation included photographs of each food and the nutrient composition, the contaminant composition, the laboratory work being a very important part of it, and people's ideas around how local food improves health of the people. So throughout the whole research initiative, not only in the Canadian circumstance, but also in the international program, we had the process to look at the dichotomized portions of diet, the traditional food component and the purchased food component, the market food component, and how these two come together in the total diet. I mean, there's a balance, sometimes more traditional food, sometimes more market food. For example, here you see the percent of energy from traditional local food and the number of traditional species from the case areas. From a low of, in the Maasai area, of 10% of energy and only 35 species because of their drought-prone environment there, up to highs up close to 300 different species, with up to 90 to 95% of people's daily energy coming from their local food system. This is just some pictures from the Nuxalk Nation in British Columbia, and you can see some of their favorite traditional foods, and with salmon being an important part of the culture, and berries, and seaweed, and salmon roe, and so forth. They're some of their favorite foods. And over in Micronesia, in Ponape, an amazing array of close to 400 different species and varieties of plant foods on these small islands, as well as the different kinds of fish. The bananas were a special focus of the case study project there that the people wanted to take. Many different kinds of varieties of bananas, with the carrot banana in this country of Micronesia having an amazing content of carotene, which is a precursor of vitamin A, important for vision, up to 6,000 micrograms, which was first documented in this banana that you see there on the bottom left. So the national postage stamp that you see there was created to highlight this banana, the carrot banana, being fed to a child. Vitamin A deficiency and infantile blindness was an issue until people started to realize that they had this natural food resource right there in their community. They just had forgotten how to make the best use of it. Over in the Karen territory in Thailand, the project there really was into demonstrating and showcasing the Karen traditional foods. And they used seasonal festivals where they would invite outsiders. They would share this information with the schools. There were many programs to teach the children how to harvest and prepare the foods. It was all an amazing demonstration about how a small community of some 500 people can not only recognize all these local food resources, but make them available. And the royal family of Thailand participated in promoting the local food resources from this particular region, Karen region in western Thailand. So the stories from each of these case studies are presented free online through the Food and Agriculture Organization. The book on the left gives you the background for each of these 12 case studies, describing the food system, the nutrient work that was done in laboratories, the qualitative work that helped to understand what were the foods that were most important to different segments of the society, for festivals, for ceremonies, and so forth. The book on the right was released more recently, and it is a description of how each of these case studies built their own intervention programs to bring more knowledge and more use of these foods to the communities. So these books, as I said, they're free online from the FAO website, and you can find them easily through Google. FAO Indigenous Peoples Food Systems, and they're both about 400 pages long, but each of the case studies is described in detail, and it gives a nice mix of showing the different cultures and environments and how Indigenous peoples can take better use of their local food systems. Through the FAO, there are also 4 beautiful posters created, 2 here and 2 on the next slide. And we're hoping to be able to get these posters for the next meeting here so that you can all have a copy of them. They are, at least we have our fingers crossed that they haven't distributed them all. But they are available internationally. Another thing I wanted to mention was about the Indigenous Terra Madre meeting that took place in Shillong, Northeast India, in November of 2015. The first 3 days were meetings such as we've been having here. But the last day was an amazing festival that brought more than 70,000 people into this field. It's actually a ceremonial site for some of the tribal people in that part of India. And there you see Trina and myself. We were both presenting at the academic part of Terra Madre. But if you get the chance to attend an Indigenous Terra Madre, and I understand there's one in the works to come to the United States, maybe to Arizona, I'm not sure, but don't miss it because it's just phenomenal. But based in slow food and the celebration of food, as well as bringing out the information about the health benefits. So just a note here, Shillong is in the state of Meghalaya in northeast India. Not too many people go there as part of their travels if they get to India, but it's an amazing contribution to the indigenous world because the populations in this part of India are primarily indigenous, and in all of India there are upwards now of 800 million indigenous peoples and rising all the time. So I'm going to sort of wind up here with calling your attention to the indigenousnutrition.org website. There are 7 films there, each of about 20 minutes, that highlight the different case studies from these international programs. And you can access them from this website, but go ahead and let's see a short video it's presented from. So this little black box is what you want to click on if you get to the video.
We need to be able to control our own resources.
Salmon's always been part of our life. It's the very essence of our existence.
No canche necesitanche alpan, porque pues carne es sagrado, no canche manda.
Inaput sila tunang meg tigu mel tigi gatigu, kitonga tinu tuna utigi vatavut sivunisangin.
Kawati pa mumode li u long yua.
Now our communities are hunger-free and also healthy.
The world is losing Indigenous peoples' culture, environment, and health. It doesn't have to be that way. Visit CINE's website to learn more.
Masi.
Dhanyawadalu.
Pai mamita. Chukho buadi.
Say question.
Kuyannami.
So I'm going to close with this slide and express appreciation to many people. I know the time is tight, but especially to note Chief Bill Erasmus from the Dene Nation in Yellowknife, who has served many years as the chair of our CINE governing board, and also all of our case study collaborators and partners who brings this information together. So thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward to talking more with you these last few hours that we have together.